Well, welcome to ATG, the podcast, and I'm very pleased to be talking today to two very enthusiastic librarians whose course I attended at this year's Charleston conference. Alex Carroll is Associate Director of the Science and Engineering Library at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, and Josh Borycz is a librarian for STEM research in the same library. And I think they both of them created a pretty impressive roster of how-to guides. I looked on the site for researchers and students. But what I want to focus on today's talk is the remarkable workshop that they ran on generative AI. So let's start with you, Josh. You actually started out as a scientist. I believe you have a PhD in computational chemistry. So how did you get from there into the library?
So my experience in graduate school was a little bit, I found it to be a very difficult and sort of painful process for several reasons. One of which was that they don't really teach you how to do research in graduate school. So they'll tell you the fundamentals of how to work in whatever field you're in, computational chemistry for me, but they won't explain to you how to find papers, how to organize them, how to cite them, how to write, how to communicate your ideas well, and how to stay on top of the data that you're using. One of the examples for my group was that someone left our group and took their sort of code and data with them. And when we wanted to build on their work, we couldn't do it because they had everything. And so we had to redo all the work. And this happens all the time within many different research groups. And I thought to myself, why does this occur again and again? It keeps happening in different research groups, even at Vanderbilt. And so I thought, how could I make students and PIs' lives better by providing assistance on research? So I took a year off after I finished my PhD, and I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail in the US to kind of think about what I want to do next. And then I discovered information science. And information science, they help scientists and researchers, engineers with organization of data, and they help them with all of the aspects of research that aren't explicitly taught. And so that is what I do now, teaching what we refer to in the field as the hidden curriculum, the stuff that you will actually do from day to day, but that isn't explicitly taught.
Great. Well, so from long distance trekking to information science, that's a good one. Alex, your background is completely different. You studied humanities. You studied history before doing library science, and here you are in a science library. So how do you explain that?
Yeah, this is always such a disservice to have to go after Josh because his kind of path seems so kind of intentional and clear, and mine seems so kind of wandering to stick with the hiking kind of there, right? Josh stayed on the path, and I maybe went off of it. So yeah, so I did. I was a history student as an undergraduate. I had thought about doing a graduate training in history, looked into it, and then kind of as I thought more about what that looked like, kind of the solitary aspect of what that work kind of looked like, it didn't really resonate with me. It wasn't really what I wanted to do. So, like Josh, I took a year away from the academy. I ended up working in museums briefly. I liked kind of the intersection of working with the public and connecting with kind of research in that. But I kind of wanted something a little more academic than what museums looked like. And so that ended up leading me towards library science. While doing my library degree, I ended up working in science libraries, kind of, really almost kind of serendipitously. I did my library degree at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and one of the long-standing partnerships that Chapel Hill has is with the United States Environmental Protection Agency, which has one of its large research laboratories, is there in the Research Triangle, North Carolina. So I had the opportunity to work at that library, and really kind of when I started looking into what I wanted to do as a professional librarian, science library jobs were the ones that kept calling. So what I ended up doing was just kind of, I ended up landing into science libraries more kind of by circumstance than really by path. But once I got into them, what I found is that kind of my outsider perspective of having kind of a humanities background combined with the kind of social science background that you get in information science really allowed me to kind of fit into the research workflows of researchers in a way that was really value additive and made me recognize that, kind of as Josh said, what we can really help researchers with is actually not so much the content expertise because they're the content experts, but what we can really help them with is the actual kind of process of sense making and storing their information and retrieving it in much more kind of efficient ways. And so that's ended up how I've built my career, is kind of in that space.
Fascinating. And I noticed you also, among other things, you're involved in, is it the Journal for the Medical Libraries Association?
Yes, so that is also one of those things, right, where you just kind of you wind your way into there. So that was I started my career at the University of Maryland, working with the College of Agriculture. And what's interesting about agriculture in the United States is that it's kind of this weird mix of physical and applied and life and medical sciences. And so a lot of kind of where I ended up initially as a professional association home was the Medical Library Association, because of working with animal science students and working with veterinary medicine students there at Maryland. So I published a few times with in the JMLA, and then ended up doing some reviews. You get asked to do the editorial board, and then once upon somehow or another you find yourself being an associate editor or the interim editor in chief, which blissfully I no longer am. But and that's been a fun kind of thing to do, to get involved in publishing as well.
So you strike me as both of you people who get involved, which is probably not always a good thing. So how did you both get how did you both get involved in AI? Because it's common as librarians to provide information, to provide tips and sort of tricks for research and so on. But generative AI is not quite so common. How did you get involved in AI?
Well, so we all started hearing about AI some years ago, mostly in a negative light. Like I would listen to a lot of podcasts about it from, discussions with people like Sam Harris and Steven Pinker, and their differences in opinion on what it was going to result in the future. I heard a lot of thought problems, things like Rocco's basilisk, where if those who didn't come along to help AI come into existence would be tortured by it when it sort of took over the world. And there's this the paper clip monster, where if you asked AI without any context to make the most paper clips that it possibly could, it would turn all people into paper clips.
Yes.
And there's all these just sort of thought problems, experiments or mental experiments people would run on what AI could do. And people were really worried that it would take over the world like some sort of Skynet thing and end all life. So this was kind of the discussion for a long time, but people weren't really worried about what has actually resulted from this version of AI, which is that it would kind of just take over college essays and make it easier to write a college essay, or make a weird image very quickly, ruin graphic artists' potential futures for career. So no one was discussing that, and I think part of it is just because they didn't expect it to come out as fast as they did. I remember I had used some of these image generators before, and I thought they were a little fun and a little silly, and some of the text generation, but we didn't think that ChatGPT would come out so quickly. I thought it was 5-10 years in the future that this wouldn't happen. So we weren't ready for the actual real life result of how AI would impact our work and our lives. And then when it came out, we started using it and experimenting with it, and we knew that students would eventually begin using it, and it was going to be another alternative tool for finding information and writing papers. It's just another new information tool, and we started to think, how could it be used for research in a way that makes sense? So we started thinking about, how does it work? What are the positives of the tool? What are the negatives of the tool? And we concentrated on teaching students how they could apply this in a way that would help them still learn, but make their lives easier in terms of writing papers, in terms of engaging with papers and the research process. So that's kind of how we got involved in it. Do you have anything to add, Alex?
Yeah, I would say that's right. I think from, in our roles at Vanderbilt, we work with computer scientists, right? And I think Josh had it right, that one of the things that kind of, if we think about like 3 years ago, one of the things that we kind of would think about is we would talk to researchers, right, who would be doing work in like deep learning or computer vision. And what always struck us is just how complicated these problems were. And, Josh mentioned that I think a lot of times people almost forget that the image generators like DALL-E came out actually before ChatGPT, right? So GPT-3 was not the first GPT, obviously, right, based on the number, but the kind of the first one that really captured the popular imagination was DALL-E. But those early image generating prompts, as Josh said, kind of the thing that would always strike you is just kind of how easy it was for them to do weird, screwy things, right? You'd ask it, draw me a pizza box, and it would make a box that looked like it was made out of pizza, right?
Mm.
Rather than because there's no actual reasoning going on there, right? And
Mm.
so when those things were coming out, it never really occurred to us initially that these were things that were going to be um, transform, like really impact our work, much less transform our work. And so I don't know that it was we were immediately struck by these things when we first even saw GPT come on, because as Josh mentioned, we were thinking about how students might use these things, but really we were thinking, well, the training data underlying these things isn't going to include any of the paid wall journal articles that they actually need to use. So do we really need to worry about our students using these things that much? And so I think there was, we didn't jump both feet in right away, but I think we eventually kind of, as Josh intimated, worked our way there.
Hmm. So, how did it lead to the workshops? Because these workshops, the one I attended was, I think, 3 hours and quite interactive. So, what led to the workshop starting?
Yeah, so we started as a result of thinking about how these things could apply to research. We started introducing AI concepts into our course schedules, into the various classes that we teach for undergrads and graduate students. So
Mm.
normally we teach how to find resources, how to do systematic searching, and then in that beginning section we started to incorporate how to use AI to help you with it, and what are the limits of AI, and what are the ways that it can really help you. And when in incorporating those, we started adding more and more because more professors became interested in it. Other people were kind of just speaking negatively about AI, as if just don't use it, it's banned, you don't, we don't want it, it's gonna make you stop learning, you're just
Mm.
going to use it to cheat. It was considered a very negative thing, um, and so we wanted to introduce what how it could be practically used, and began incorporating it into these courses in that context. And then we started building on that. What are some examples that could get students to think about how AI works and how they might use it? And then we invested in an AI tool called Scite, SCITE,
Yep.
which essentially, instead of just using the whole internet to pull information off and give you an answer, it uses peer-reviewed research papers and gives you citations of the peer-reviewed research papers that it gives you when it gives you an output. So there's an example of a new tool that someone jumped on right away and was able to improve how these tools could be used for research immediately. So then we looked into that, we invested in it, we started teaching students how to use it, and it kind of just grew from there over time into a full 3 hour long workshop.
Mm. How many
Yeah,
of the workshops? Sorry, Alex, go ahead.
I was just going to say, because I think one of the things that Josh and I found when we were teaching students this is that it got them really excited, right? I think a lot of librarians are used to teaching lectures to students and students not seeming super enthusiastic about them. But us talking about these tools, students were really excited to tell us what they knew about them, or they would love to tell us about all of the things they had seen it do that were weird,
Mm.
or they would even tell us reasons that they had been told that they shouldn't use it, or things that they had done that they, felt like they were hush hush. In fact, I remember in like fall 2023, us going into classes and bringing this up, and
Mm.
students like looking at each other like, oh no, they know, right? Like, and so it was really, really interesting, right? Where it's like,
Mm.
it was super fun to have these discussions. And as Josh mentioned, kind of really our approach to this was not to tell students that they can't use these tools, right? Because in a lot of ways, that's like telling a river not to run, right? It's just, you're putting sandbags in front of a river that you're not going to stop flowing, right?
Mm.
What instead we really did, so focus the students on, is thinking about what were the ways that you might use these things effectively, right?
Yeah.
Or what were the ethical ways you could use these? Really thinking about the use cases for when and when not to use these things.
Mm.
And the more we kind of did this with students, the more we kind of thought, we would love for more of our colleagues to get to have this experience, right? Because we saw professionally, right, that there was a lot of anxiety about this, right? We would see
Mm.
listservs of other librarians asking, like, are you using these things? How are you doing these things?
Mm.
And then I think to maybe anticipate the question that I interrupted you on here, the first kind of thing that caught our attention was there's a small conference in Virginia held annually called the Innovative Library Classroom, and they put out a call for proposals for a pre-conference workshop. And I had taught, or I had done this conference like 10 years ago or something at their inaugural meeting, and they were celebrating their 10th anniversary. And I said, Josh, this might be a fun venue for us. This conference is just teaching librarians. These are all folks who do really undergraduate focused instruction. I think these folks would really be kind of a great audience for us to share how we go about teaching and bringing these tools in. And so that was the first venue that we did a workshop in.
Sounds great. And what was remarkable, I felt from having attended one of the workshops, is that what came across was your kind of optimism and positive view of AI. So can I assume you're both advocates of AI?
I would say I am an advocate of the use of AI. I use it almost every day. I teach a course on coding R and Python. It's indispensable for that. It makes life far easier. It's incorporated into coding tools like RStudio in a way that allows you to finish a line of code automatically. It kind of predicts what you're going to do next, which saves a huge amount of time. It's good for brainstorming. You can really just bounce ideas off of it and see what you think. It can give sort of basic factual data. It can even analyze, data for you, turn things into tables that are publishable from a disorganized text file. So it's really very useful for some of these tedious tasks that prevent people from engaging in new research. And it can also meet you at whatever level you're at in some interesting new skill you're trying to learn, whether it's statistics or even coding in a different language. And it can explain to you step by step how to get from where you are to a higher level without you having to go and dig into various textbooks and gather together everything yourself. So I'm an advocate for it. I think it's incredibly useful, and I encourage people to engage with it within its limitations, of course.
And I think maybe what makes kind of the workshop work is that I'm probably a little further away than Josh on the continuum. I think kind of that tension is maybe what kind of makes this thing work. Is that I would say I wouldn't necessarily say that I am a AI skeptic, but I don't know that I get to advocate, right? I think I did an ACERL webinar one time where I called it a skeptic's guide to AI, and I don't know that I'm quite. I'm maybe a one-over skeptic, but I've got, I think, a few more reservations about it. I'm a little more conflicted about it. I think where I kind of, the issue I run into, right, is I agree with Josh that when using these tools to help you do tasks that you already know how to do efficiently, it feels like magic when you're doing it, right? There are times, right, where if I was kind of trying to generate a search string from scratch, there's no question that AI could get me started. If I wanted it to do something to manipulate some data, right? I can do something using the AI faster than remembering how to redo a pivot table in Excel or something like that, right? The issue I always run into, and Josh kind of intimated this, is I get much more nervous about these tools helping me with things that I don't know how to do. And the reason why is we kind of bump up against, and Josh and I have kind of joked about this, what we think of as, I think this is Michael Crichton, the old author of Jurassic Park, coined this idea called the Gell-Mann effect, which he named after the physicist Murray Gell-Mann. And the Gell-Mann effect, which Michael Crichton was talking about in terms of popular media, is the idea that you flip open, you imagine, no one actually flips open the newspaper anymore, but let's say you're scrolling through your algorithm, right? You're scrolling through your feed, and you come across a news story about your specific industry, right? So for Josh and me, the classic of this would be that we open up a Chronicle of Higher Education article that happens to talking about academic libraries, right? And the article we always complain about is the one where they say, where did all the books go, right? And you get mad at it, right? You sit there reading it and you think, this author had no idea what they're talking about. Every person they interviewed was just a cherry-picked source that is just confirming their premise. Michael Crichton joked about this, that these stories are often so backwards that they are the wet streets cause rain, is what he called it, right? Where you're reading the author's piece and it's so fundamentally wrong, right, that they mix up effects for causes, right? But Michael pointed out the point that we all do, which is that we then close that article, we click on the next article, and we read it as if we're learning something extremely revelatory about a new topic, right? And so this happens all the time, right? Like, I could read a news article, right, about, I don't know, anything happening across the world, and I would think I would learn something new, but I read about something that I'm an expert in, and all of a sudden I'm dubious of how well-sourced or well-accurate this is. So this is what I always worry about with these AI tools, right? Which is that if I ask it to explain something that I know really in depth, I'll start seeing holes in its reasoning, and I'll think, this is okay, right? But they don't really get to the nuance that I want to see, that as an expert I recognize is really important. Yet I will flip over and then I will trust it to explain a new concept to me, right? And so that's kind of where I run into it. I kind of am still having a tension that I have a tough time reconciling with this, that I would say kind of prevents me from being a full-throated advocate for these things. Because I think what always concerns me for our students, right, is the less you know about something, the more likely you are to take what you're hearing at face
Gospel.
value, right? And the less
Mm.
likely you are to kind of take that kind of healthy adversarial skepticism
Mhm.
to what you're getting out of the generative AI.
Absolutely. Um, well, we'll come back to a bit more to sort of some of the details about generative AI because this is a big, this is a fascinating topic we can go into. But just to sort of finish off on the workshops, I think one thing that you both seem to be very keen on was a kind of an AI literacy, a sort of developing a kind of an awareness of how to use these tools. So, do you think that's true to say? Is that your approach? There is such a thing as a literacy. You can work out how to use these tools well.
I think that's a pretty decent way to describe it. We talk about, the old concept of information literacy for research and how you should be skeptical of things and make sure to find the provenance of articles before you use them in your own work and double check that they're true and the authority of the things that you're citing before you cite them. And the same thing kind of applies here, except this is kind of filtering through the information for you, right? And so you not only have to understand how the information is derived, you have to understand sort of how this tool mines for information in the way that it does, and which information is it gathering. So
Mm.
one of the things that we started with was teaching students the 5 I's. So to be a little bit descriptive of what is the limitation of an AI tool or a large language model. We talked about how these tools are incomplete. They don't have all the information that you would want because it's not just posted on the web and then you can find it right away like you could with a journal article.
Mm.
It's all so some of these things are like a year or more old when you use ChatGPT. Also, it doesn't have access to things that are proprietary journal articles. It can't access that information. It's just open access articles, open access sources.
Mm.
So it doesn't have all the information that you would necessarily need to get a complete picture of a research field. It's also inconsistent. If you ask it the same question 10 times, it's not going to spit out the same answer 10 times. It'll give you different citations and different answers, potentially even different numbers. So that's something to pay attention to. It can also be incoherent. We've all heard of hallucinations, of large language models making up sources, inventing things whole cloth. It happened with a particular case of a lawyer writing a brief on a
Mm.
specific subject. This was, I think, in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, and the lawyer just had it write the brief for him, and the judge asked for the case law that it was referencing. It didn't exist. It was just made up.
Mm.
And that is because these tools are really just trying to make you happy rather than give you the answer that's correct. There's an upvote or downvote tendency in these tools. And that's why one of the other eyes is indulgent. These things try to make you happy. They give you the answer that you want to hear. So you have to, if you
Mm.
want an answer that is skeptical, you have to explicitly ask for it. And
Mm.
even then, it won't necessarily give you an answer that is skeptical enough for you to trust. And then also, these tools can be illogical. Okay, so they're not thinking through concepts. They're
Mm.
not thinking through ideas that that people in ways that people might do. They're
Mm.
just predicting the next word with some probability that will make you the most happy based on the the parameters that they're deriving from the whole set of uh, words in the model that they're using. So
Mm.
whether it's the whole internet or in the case of Cite, whether it's research papers, that's all it's doing, predicting the next word.
Mm.
Um, and so as a result of that, they can't solve problems that are very simple for people to solve. You may have heard of the example of how many R's are in strawberry, right? If you ask um, a large language model, and many of them, it's been fixed now, but if you ask many of them, how many R's are in the word strawberry, it will say two. And then there was a case where say that's wrong. Can you give me another guess? It will say one, but of course the correct answer, we all know is three. And the reason for that is because of how the tool works. It's a process called tokenization, where it uses spaces between words to break up words and find the context of where those words belong so that it can gather information about how those words are used and pull parameters from the data set. So to get it to work properly, you would need to put spaces in between all the letters of the word strawberry to create separate tokens. And so teaching that basic thing alone will help students and PIs avoid issues with the use of AI tools like this. So understanding those limitations is fundamental. And then knowing those limitations, how can you actually use it in a way that you know that you can trust? And one of the key things that we teach there is always keep your ideas at the forefront. Okay. So the ideas you discuss with your colleagues and your expertise, and then just consider it like a crazy, slightly delusional, hyper intelligent friend that you're going to be bouncing ideas off of. But never let it take over. Never let it write everything for you or trust it completely. So that's kind of where we started and where we ended up with that.
Great. I think this is the longest conversation I've had on generative AI before the word hallucinations was mentioned. So that's pretty good. Anything to add to that, Alex?
No, I think Josh has got it right. I mean, I think what we really kind of focus on is getting folks to think about not letting these tools do the analysis for you, right? Josh kind of mentioned, because we don't like to try to get into the epistemology of what constitutes a mind, right? But I think from our working definition, right, these things really are not capable of doing analytical insights in the way that the human brain is, that we think these things work categorically different than the way the human brain does. The strawberry example being a good one is that you can update the model to get that answer correct, but the way that updating is doing is not real learning, right? Or learning in the way that we think of as toddlers learning, kind of their kind of pattern recognition, right? And so that's a really important thing in terms of that these tools can be really good in kind of sourcing ideas for you, right? But the more you ask it to do higher level analysis for you, the more inappropriate the use is. So I think Josh has done that well, and kind of talking that I think as Josh mentioned, the 5I framework that we kind of introduced to students, we think is a good way of kind of capturing a lot of why those limitations are what they are.
Yeah. How do you measure the success and impact of your workshops? What the result is on the students who've taken it?
Well, I would say that we know it's a success only if we get invited to a podcast based on the people that attend it, right? Is the clearest sign of success. No, I mean we ask our participants to do a feedback form, which we have a couple of questions. I think one of the most important things is we also make time in the workshop to ask people to actually do the feedback, because we know that if we ask people to do it after the fact, it's not going to happen based on our own behaviors, right? So we have a feedback that we collect from our participants, and I would say it's been really helpful. When we did that first workshop back at the Innovative Library Classroom, the biggest piece of feedback we got was that initially it was 2 hours long. People wanted more time to talk, both in small groups and in large groups. And so then we were kind of thinking about, all right, do we want to keep doing this? It's like, yeah, and let's try doing it at 3 hours and see if that's the right amount of time. And I think 3 hours feels like the right amount of time. I felt like as we've done it now, it's a couple different times at the 3 hour mark. That feels like there's more opportunity for the ideas to sit in and for folks to kind of wrestle with these ideas and share out kind of their own feelings about it. So that's kind of I think one of the biggest pieces of feedback we've gotten and that we've iterated on.
I noticed in the 3 hours you do go through very quickly the sort of principles of how a large language model works. So that's quite a sort of rapid overview. Do you think that's helpful for the students, many of whom are not going to be very technical?
Yeah, we're not computer scientists, so I don't understand the fundamental construction of sort of the generative pre-trained transformers. I don't really get how they code them into existence. And I don't understand completely how they pull all the data from the web to, construct the answers that they get. But I do understand what people kind of do when they are typing something into ChatGPT and what happens in between the input and the output. Okay. That's how I think about it. That's how most people think about it. Like when you try to explain Google to someone, I type something in here, something happens, and question mark profit. So that's the way that we conceived of it. So when you type something in there like Mary had a little lamb, what does it do? So the first step is it takes those individual words and it breaks them up. This is the tokenization process. Mary had a little lamb, okay? And it assigns each of those a vector, and each vector is just a series of numbers. And each one of those numbers captures a different aspect of what that word means, how it relates to other words, where it would fall in the context of the entire human language. If you were to use the word lamb, where might you see that in the whole sort of training model? Like you might see it in farming, you might see it in literature, you might see it here. And so it will pull different aspects of that word out by using those vectors. And the difference between vectors sees how things are related. Okay, so if you want the capital of a state versus the state itself, the vector distance between those two will be the same for each one. So you can see how words are related based on the distance of these vectors and how often words co-occur. Okay, so if two words appear together a lot in the same sentence, you know that they're likely to appear together in other sentences. And so it's basic semantics and syntax that you're capturing. And then from that, you take what you've typed in and you throw it out to the parameters derived from the whole internet or all human knowledge, whatever you want to call it, or all the research papers, and you find where it fits, and then you start generating an output at the end based on all of the puzzle pieces coming together in a way that makes sense. So that's how you get from Mary Had a Little Lamb to the output that ChatGPT or most large language models would give, which is whose fleece was white as snow. That's how it knows. And that, I think, at a basic level is how most people can understand it. And given that each of these steps is fairly, the way that these things work is actually pretty intuitive. If you think about it that way, you can understand the limitations based on those basic descriptions of the steps.
I'll say, though, a lot went into kind of deciding what level of depth that we want to include that in the workshops, right? Kind of thinking, how do we balance talking about this in a meaningful way versus alienating folks that didn't want any of this at all, right? And, I think, Josh is right that there's a lot of things that we're leaving out even in that technical discussion. But I think a good analogy to think about that is that if we're teaching students Web of Science, right, how to do a search in Web of Science, we don't actually talk about how the retrieval really works in Web of Science, right? We're really focusing on the search strategy and how do you build it. We're not actually talking about how the database itself does join functions to turn the Boolean operators and use the key tags to actually pull from the record the specific fields or whatever, right? When you're teaching these kinds of things, right, you're really thinking about the use case of the user in front of you. And in most cases, you're thinking much more on the actual user interface layer, like Josh was mentioning, than you are on the underlying tool. And so that's kind of how we landed on a little bit of technical under the hood, but not the whole thing.
That's a good analogy. But coming back to hallucinations, one of the what you could maybe sort of describe as the apocalyptic school sort of tends to sort of they use the word hallucinations almost as a sort of a statement, sort of as soon as talk about of generative AI comes up, they say, but the hallucinations, it's no good, we can't use it. So how do you what's your response when people say, I can't use it because of the hallucinations?
Well, so you can actually go to a website. I can't remember exactly the name, but if you Google like hallucination rates for large language models, you can see a ranking of which ones hallucinate the most, which ones make up their answers or citations the most. And you can see that for the best versions, like ChatGPT 4 Turbo, I think is widely considered the best general large language model now. It has a hallucination rate of 2.5%. So that's requires caution. Hallucination rate of 2.5% definitely requires caution whenever you're asking questions to any AI. But that's why you should always keep your ideas at the forefront, as we discussed earlier. So it's, what do you want to get out of it? How can you bounce ideas off of it while still being skeptical of the answers it gives you? How can you take it and use it to help build your knowledge base to the level where you need it to be to complete the projects that you want? So if you are working in a team of people, or if you're working by yourself on a project, always keep your basic goals at the forefront and use this as a supplementary tool to make your life easier. A lot of things, if you one of the things that is constantly talked about in the media these days is misinformation and disinformation, and there's people throwing their opinions all over the place on different websites, and a lot of what people are putting out there is made up, or the authors are unattributed, and you don't know who you can trust. Some of the stuff online is made up. So even using Google, I mean, you could get a hallucinatory opinion of something just by only looking at one sector of how the news writes about a specific idea, by Googling the wrong set of keywords. And so keeping that in mind, AI is not that much different. You have to be skeptical. It will require extra effort for you to really gain a deeper understanding of how these tools are used, but it shouldn't stop you from using them, especially if just a small amount of supplementing the use of these tools with backup information or discussions with experts in the field will help resolve those issues. So the hallucination rate in and of itself is not a good reason to dispense with these tools whole cloth.
And building off of that, right? We were all just at Charleston, right? The idea of there being incorrect or outright fraudulent information, right, is not limited to just an AI tool, and it's not limited to just the popular web, right? I couldn't tell. It seemed like every concurrent session at Charleston had something that talking about either fraudulent or retractions or whatever, right? So the
Yep.
idea that somehow the stuff that's in the Web of Science core collection is free of incorrect information, right? Obviously doesn't hold water, right? And it's not like good journals, right? Or I'll put good in quotes, scare quotes here, right? It's not as if good journals are immune from that either, right? There are plenty of high impact journals that have completely retracted fraudulent papers as well, right? And we don't go around saying that you can no longer trust anything published in Lancet because of the Wakefield paper, right?
Absolutely, yeah. No, I completely agree. And in fact, my view is we've all learned how to use Google, and we've got used to sort of, if you ask Google a stupid question, you're going to get a stupid answer. If you ask it the meaning of life, you're not going to necessarily trust what it says. So no, I completely agree. But let's go back to Alex's point. You said, Alex, that you were a little bit hesitant. When you start working with Gen AI, working in an area where you know something about, and this seems to be a sort of an increasingly common viewpoint. So how do you get beyond that sort of course, I'm going to try Gen AI with something I'm familiar with, but at what point do you get beyond and say, okay, I trust it, let's go for it?
Oh man, that's a good question. I think one of what can be really helpful here is to actually think a little bit about some of the information literacy frameworks we kind of think about when we actually teach students about these kinds of stuff, right? So it's if we think about like some of the popular ones like SIFT, right, or like Caulfield's, right? Those can be like the idea behind all of those, right, is that, well, if you're going to evaluate a source of information, you're going to think about the context it was created in, right? So it's all going to be about who is the person that made this, why did they make it, why am I reading it? What's funny, of course, about those is that all of a sudden those kind of don't really work in the AI because I don't know what the ghost in the machine, why it wants anything I'm reading here, right? I don't know what the context of who created this thing is. But I do think the information literacy framework that can be pretty useful when thinking about using a Gen AI tool to explore a new topic is the lateral reading idea, right? Which is that reading one thing, reading what the Gen AI says, and then looking for kind of a confirmation or looking for kind of elaboration elsewhere. And I think that can be a really great way to use these tools, is using them to get ideas and then see if those ideas kind of bear fruit elsewhere. In a lot of ways, right, this is not all that different than what kind of the basic idea behind handbooks and encyclopedias was always back in the day, right? Or 20 years ago when Wikipedia was first launched, right? And of course, there's like real clear echoes from all of the same educational moral panics we had about Wikipedia, right? Which is that we don't know who wrote this thing. There might be factual errors in here, so you can't use it at all. And nobody says that anymore, right? Nobody says that you shouldn't use Wikipedia to look up the boiling point of mercury, right? It's probably accurate, right? And so I think there's similarities though, right? Which is that you would have maybe used Wikipedia, or you would have used a print reference material once upon a time to get you started and to help you kind of then lateral read into more kind of in-depth sources later on. And so I think that's still a better way to think about using these tools if you're trying to learn something new, viewing them almost as an on-demand Wikipedia entry, and giving them kind of that level of credibility, right? Which is that probably a lot of this is right-ish, but I don't know that I want to go lead a seminar based on this alone, right? Maybe I want to go see, can I
Mm,
substantiate this somewhere else?
mm. Very good. It sounds like the wheel coming full circle, and that AI literacy and information literacy are not actually that far apart. Can I ask you, one of the interesting things that came out of the workshop, and I've picked up from other places as well, the what you could describe as the kind of the anthropomorphism of sort of AI, the fact that it's sometimes Gen AI works better if you treat it like a human. Um, I sort of idly note down sort of tips for sort of getting better results, and when I look at those tips, these are things like the phrase "take your time." Or think before you answer. It's a very human-like question.
Yeah, that can be the case. So prompt engineering is one of the things that has been discussed quite a lot since these things began. And if you look at it, it's basically just providing a lot of context, exactly how you want the answers to be given, and how you want the AI to sort of think about the answer, with air quotes there. And that's that's exactly what you would do in a conversation with a colleague or a conversation with a friend is you would say, okay, can you explain this to me as if I was a kindergartner? Like you're an expert in this. Could you help me out? You can ask AI to do that, and you should. It does help give better answers, and giving more context to it does help you pull the answers you want. And people aren't necessarily used to that because in Google, it's just using keywords, and a spider to just find web pages that already exist. But this is pulling things together and generating a response that's tuned to exactly what you want. So it can, like I was saying before, it takes the words you're using and finds where it's used in the parameter set that it has with its billions of parameters and language used from all over the internet, and it's generating a response that is tuned to exactly what you've requested. And so if you ask it to say write a poem in the style of H.P. Lovecraft or something, it goes to the H.P. Lovecraft section of the internet and it sees how he writes, and then it will generate a response, that gives you that type of answer. And a person, might not be as good at doing it as an AI, but it's the same type of thing that you can ask a person to do, uh, because they're addressing you and your specific needs at the moment. And that's one of the great advantages of using um, large language models.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think, some folks get uncomfortable or get outright hostile to the idea of anthropomorphizing these things, right? I even kind of feel my hackles come up when I think about the word trusting these things, right? Because it's like, I can't trust the ghost, right, or whatever.
Mm.
But I think a good way that I think about this is to think about that these things are really good at sentiment analysis. And if you are thinking about providing more sentiment in the context that you're providing it, it's going to give you a more effective answer. So if that makes folks that don't want to make these things seem like they're human, or they don't want to give it a human brain or whatever, just think about that you're providing the syntax machine with more sentiment to work with.
Sounds good. Alex, a question for you. We both talked about you work in a science library, and much of your workshop was inevitably about sort of sort of factual scientific topics. How applicable are these tools to social science and history? Are they being used yet?
So I think this is a tough one, right? One of the things that I think pedagogically, I think this one is a lot kind of potentially scarier for humanists and social scientists than it is for scientists, right? If you think about for an undergraduate chemistry lab, you still have to do the lab, right? Like you still have to actually run the synthesis. Maybe the AI could help you write the lab report, but you know that the students are still actually conducting the experiment. Whereas if you've always assigned a term paper on the Odyssey, all of a sudden that becomes a lot harder to do, right? Because not only do the LLM trained on the entire corpus of the Odyssey, right? It's trained on who knows how many actual critical analyses of the
Yeah.
Odyssey, right? So I think sometimes this can feel like really almost like existential, I think, from a pedagogical classroom standpoint. But of course, like I often think that there's nothing new under the sun in these kinds of like shortcuts for student writing. Like, when I was a student, right, they sold Spark Notes in print version in Barnes and Noble, right? And
Mhm.
I'm pretty sure I probably bought one for Charles Dickens once or twice, right? So like the idea of students taking shortcuts on term papers or looking for assistance on term papers, I don't think is anything new, right? But I do think, right, this is an opportunity to think maybe a little more creatively about why did we ask them to do these assignments in the first place, right? and to maybe take a step back and think about, is there new opportunities? Is there different things we want to do in the classroom? From a research standpoint, I actually think there are a ton of really, really interesting applications for the humanities and for social sciences. One of the things that these tools do is potentially lower the cost of kind of doing computer vision work, like by orders of magnitude. One thing that Josh and I have already explored with a little bit is a lot of times we do paper surveys of our students. We do paper surveys because they'll actually fill them out. And one of the problems with paper surveys is that it generates paper, right? And especially if you want kind of qualitative response to your students, then you have to dig through, scores and scores of paper. And, it's really tempting to just leave those in the filing cabinet, never look at them. Well, but it turns out, right, GPT-4, if you tell it this is a piece of paper, it's got handwriting on it, can you turn it into text for me? It will do that for you. And then if you say, here's a bunch of text you generated for me, could you put them into rows and columns so I can put them in Excel? It'll do that too. So we've seen some cool stuff. And Josh, I think we've also seen already folks on campus here at Vanderbilt doing really interesting stuff with these as well.
Yeah, we just had for part of our research engagement talks with the libraries. So we have PIs come and talk to the librarians about their research. And one of the people we had discuss research was Jane Landers, who's a very widely known historian, and works in the humanities with documents from Latin America. And these are documents that were gathered by Catholic and Protestant religious organizations on sort of enslaved people from around the world that came through those Latin American countries. And some of these documents, as you might imagine, they're hundreds of years old, are dilapidated, they're broken to pieces, and the language used in them is kind of old-fashioned and hard to understand, and the paper is smudged, and some of the edges are burned. A lot of them were thrown in the furnace, and or there's like fungus growing on them. There's a lot of issues with analyzing these documents. So Jane Landers and her team, one of our colleagues who works in the library named Daniel Jenkins, he took these and scanned them. So they're not even taking the documents away from these original locations at which they exist. They're still located in those areas, and they scan them at very high resolution. And from that, they're able to use AI large language models to do pattern recognition on the writing of like this old Spanish and Portuguese documents, and pick out details about the names of different enslaved people, and their birth dates, and some of the quotes that they've made, where they ended up, what children they had, and sort of their, even things as far as their experiences in the journeys that they've been through, and the tribal discussions of different tribal activities that they engaged in back home. And so we've got this wealth of information which we're able to now gather and analyze in a way that we never have been before, based on using these AI tools and this pattern recognition, which is available only because of this huge parameter set that we're deriving things from using the generative pre-trained transformers. So it just opens up a whole world of information analysis that wasn't possible before, and has really helped us, in this particular case, make the world a better place. Just because we can capture this information on people that were essentially discarded and ignored for hundreds of years.
I'd love to let you two loose on a sort of a couple of humanities departments where they sort of to fire them up with enthusiasm. It sounds great. Can we finish off with a couple of sort of recommendations? Do you have any recommendations for libraries on how to engage, how to sort of how to deal with Gen AI?
Yeah. So where we started was essentially assuming that the students had kind of used these before, but hadn't looked into how they work at all, and didn't understand their limitations. So when we initially began incorporating these into the classroom, we started with one slide. The title of that slide was, "Why can't I just use ChatGPT to do all my work, right? Why can't I?" And so then we explained the 5 I's, and the limitations of these tools, and what you should think about while you're using them. And most students were just thinking, oh, because ChatGPT was the first one out, they didn't understand even what a large language model was or how the AI worked with it. So then we started to incorporate how they actually work and why those limitations exist. So start with just the user base level. Say, why why can't I just use ChatGPT for everything? Here's why, because these are its limitations.
Mm.
And then talk about what you can use it for and what are the benefits of using it. What about it will make your life easier? How can it help you code? As I said before, how can it help you with brainstorming? How can it, give you ideas, or create search strings for you? Really break down, instead of having to write out your own Boolean operator long search string. How can it create that for you in a way that you could plug it into Web of Science and get papers that are relevant to you? So focusing on the limitations and then going on to what you can use it for, and then how it works is how I would suggest beginning.
Well, and even more fundamental than that, right? It's just really important to just try using these things, right? You just have to kind of use them for fun, right? Have them do weird stuff, right? Have them write a recipe where you're asking it to replace margarine with like aquafaba chickpeas or whatever. Like you've got to figure out, right? Like what these things do, the weird things they can do, and also then try to see are there tasks that it seems to be decently good at, right? And I think kind of Josh mentioned one that we focus on a lot is it is really cool that these tools can develop search strings, right? That and the search strings are not perfect. One of the weird things they do is if you ask it to come up with a search string, it loves to put terms in phrases, right? It loves to use phrase markings, use the quotation marks really unnecessarily often. It's hard to know why it does that, right? We've often speculated that it's probably trained on like published systematic review search protocols, and those are using phrase searches appropriately, and so it just thinks that a search string looks like this because, again, there's no analytic mind here. It's just pattern matching, and it thinks that when I see a lot of ors, that means it should have quotation marks too. But, right, like a lot of the things that it'll use, right, the fundamentals there are pretty good, right? And it's a really good starting point to model for students, right? Whereas, if you show the students Boolean searching and by hand, maybe they do it, maybe they don't. If they realize that these tools can act as kind of an accelerator for them, maybe there is a chance that they'll actually take you up on it. So it's really about practicing, and it's about looking for ways that you can integrate these into what you're already doing, rather than inventing entirely new kind of skill sets.
Great. Sounds fascinating. I know that I've there's one use I've found of Gen AI, which has been incredibly helpful, which is writing glossary articles for sort of technical definitions, and it's been amazing just to sort of to bounce my view with the system and back again. And so yeah, I think I completely agree. Sort of find some simple things that it can do and do those well. Anyway, thank you very much, gentlemen. You've been it's been a great session talking with you both, and I look forward to hopefully attending another workshop, maybe at perhaps at next year's Charleston, or finding out sort of where you go to next, and learning more about AI. I don't think I'll ever look at recipes in quite the same way after doing your workshop.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thanks. Bye. You. Elizabeth, you just strayed on to the end of. But I think Don will probably tell me that I think we can probably